to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the August 21st, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdillah, and tonight I have Tina Stagg and Angelo Di Grazia here with me from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get started. Over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Michael, and good evening, space fans. Straight into some International Space Station news. NASA expects an experimental module to remain attached to the ISS through to the late 2020s. The Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, or BEAM, was installed on the station in 2016 for what was initially a 2-year mission to test technologies for future expandable modules. NASA has since converted the module into a cargo stowage unit, and at a recent conference, a project official said engineering analysis had cleared BEAM to remain on the station until at least 2028. Bigelow Aerospace, which developed BEAM, is using that technology for future larger modules, including commercial ISS modules and free-flying stations. NASA's Robonaut is getting ready to return to the International Space Station. At a recent conference, a project official said the humanoid robot will likely be flown back to the station late this year on a cargo mission, then undergo checkouts. The robot flew to the station in 2011, but suffered technical problems a few years later that led NASA to ship the robot back to Earth last year. Engineers traced the problem to design flaws in the robot's electrical system that have been corrected. Roscosmos is planning to launch its own humanoid robot, Fedor or Skybot F850, to the station this month, but it is expected to remain on the station only briefly. NASA plans to conduct an independent review of the non-profit organisation that runs the part of the ISS designated a national lab. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine announced last week that he was seeking the review of the ISS National Lab, formerly known as the Centre for the Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, to ensure it was on mission and appropriately resourced to perform research. That review will be led by Elizabeth Cantwell of the University of Arizona and is expected to take 12 weeks to complete. In a separate letter to CASIS, NASA called for a strategic pause in its activities until after the review was completed. Now to NASA's Moon Artemis program. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center will manage the agency's efforts to develop a lander needed to achieve the goal of landing astronauts on the Moon by 2024. The announcement, made last week, was overshadowed by political wrangling about which centre should be responsible. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, speaking at Marshall, said the Huntsville, Alabama Centre will have overall responsibility for the Human Landing System program, which will oversee industry development of a human-rated landing system. This was not a decision that was made lightly, Bridenstine said. A lot of hard work has been done here in Huntsville regarding landing systems. Other centres will be involved in various aspects of the Lunar Lander program. That includes the Johnson Space Centre, which will be responsible for the ascent module of the lunar lander that will carry the astronauts and return them to the Lunar Gateway. But several members of Congress from Texas objected to those plans in a letter to Bridenstine. Republican Senators Ted Cruz and John Cornyn and Representative Brian Babin argued that, given its history in managing human spaceflight programs, Johnson, and not Marshall, should lead lander development. What the members from Texas didn't say was that all the Apollo lunar lander expertise at Johnson has long since gone and now only resides in storage boxes. A nuclear reactor that could support human missions to the Moon and Mars should be ready for a flight demonstration in 2022. The Kilopower reactor, under development by NASA and the Department of Energy, is a fission reactor capable of producing 1 kilowatt of power, but can be scaled up to 10 kilowatts. In a recent presentation, the project leader for Kilopower at Los Alamos National Lab said the reactor could be flown into space as soon as 2022, although NASA has yet to announce plans for such a test. Turning to Europe, another parachute test for the ExoMars 2020 mission failed recently, the European Space Agency announced last week. ESA said in a statement that, in the high-altitude test earlier this month in Sweden, a parachute 35 metres in diameter suffered damage before inflation, causing a test article mimicking the lander to descend under a smaller pilot chute alone. Both that 35-metre parachute and a smaller one 15 metres across were damaged in a similar test in late May. The parachutes are key elements of the entry, descent and landing system for the mission, scheduled to launch in less than a year. ESA said in the statement that the mission team was working to understand and correct the flaw in order to launch next year, but time is running out. Back to Mike.
Thank you, Tina. And now turning to NASA planetary and space science news. Some scientists are worried that NASA's emphasis on Mars sample return could keep the agency from funding other robotic missions to the planet. NASA's current Mars exploration plans through to the 2020s focus almost entirely on a campaign of missions to collect Martian samples and return them to Earth, with virtually no other opportunities to fly other robotic missions. NASA officials said it's unlikely those later Mars sample return missions can accommodate additional payloads because of mass constraints, and that restricted budgets rule out another orbiter mission to replace existing missions like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in the near future. Not a good situation considering that the current operational Mars spacecraft are now getting old and will require replacement soon. Meanwhile, scientists have ruled out one potential source for the methane spacecraft have detected in the Martian atmosphere. Research published last week said that while one way to produce the methane would be if the planet's winds scoured rocks on the surface, liberating methane trapped within them, then those rocks would have to contain as much methane as the most hydrocarbon-rich shale found on Earth, which scientists conclude is unlikely. The methane detected intermittently by spacecraft like the Curiosity rover may instead be produced by other geological activity or by microbes. A NASA asteroid sample return mission has selected 4 potential sites on the asteroid Bennu to collect material. NASA said last week that scientists had identified 4 sites where the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft could touch down, collecting samples using a device at the end of a robotic arm. The spacecraft will now collect high-resolution images of the 4 sites so that scientists can select a primary and backup location by December this year. OSIRIS-REx will attempt to obtain the samples later in 2020 for return to Earth in 2024. And moving to China, a Chinese startup has performed another takeoff and landing test of a future reusable launch vehicle. Link Space's RLV-T5 flew to an altitude of about 300 metres before landing vertically 50 seconds after takeoff last week. The test was the third for the technology demonstrator and the highest flight to date. Link Space expects to fly a larger vehicle capable of flying to space next year as it seeks to enter the small launch vehicle market. And in India, India's Chandrayaan-2 performed a manoeuvre last week which sent the spacecraft to the moon. The translunar injection manoeuvre put the spacecraft on a trajectory to arrive at the moon, followed by another manoeuvre to enter orbit around it. The spacecraft has been gradually raising its orbit around the Earth since its launch last month. Once in orbit around the Moon, it will lower its orbit and then deploy a lander that will attempt to touch down in the south polar regions of the Moon on September the 7th. And over to you, Angelo.
Thanks, Mike. Let's go to SpaceX. A planned weekend test flight of SpaceX's Starhopper vehicle was delayed. County officials in Texas cancelled closures of the road leading to SpaceX's test site at Boca Chica scheduled for last weekend. In a tweet last week, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk said the company was still working with the FAA to get approvals for the test flight, where Starhopper will fly to 200 metres before landing. Need a bit more hazard analysis and should be clear to fly soon, Musk said. Over to Blue Origin. Blue Origin is protesting what it considers a flawed competition by the US Air Force for future launch services. The company announced last week that it filed a pre-award protest with the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, arguing that the rules set by the Air Force do not allow for a fair and open competition. The company's complaint argues that the National Security Space Launch Phase 2 launch service procurement uses unclear and ambiguous selection criteria, discriminates against new competitors by asking bidders to offer a backup launch vehicle, and restricts competition by limiting awards to 2 companies. The GAO will have up to 100 days to review the protest and make a decision. Despite the protest, Blue Origin submitted a proposal to the Air Force for the competition along with 3 other companies. Northrop Grumman, SpaceX and United Launch Alliance also submitted proposals as expected. Unless the GAO upholds Blue Origin's protest and forces the Air Force to alter the competition, the service will select 2 companies next year to split 60-40 as many as 34 missions for military and intelligence community between 2022 and 2026. Let's look at United Launch Alliance. The final launch of the single-stick version of the Delta IV is on track for this week. A Delta IV Medium Plus 4.2 rocket is scheduled to launch from Cape Canaveral Thursday morning US time, carrying the second GPS-3 satellite. The launch will be the last for the single-core version of the Delta IV, which United Launch Alliance is retiring to focus on the Atlas V and the upcoming Vulcan, both of which are more cost competitive. The triple-core Delta IV Heavy will remain in service at least to the mid-2020s. To Virgin Galactic. Virgin Galactic says Spaceport America is now ready to host flights of its Spaceship Two suborbital vehicle. The company declared operational readiness for the New Mexico Spaceport at a media event last week that featured a test flight of White Knight 2, the carrier aircraft for Spaceship Two. The spaceport now has an operational mission control centre for handling flight operations and has outfitted much of the interior of the spaceport's main building for both technical staff and guests. The company hasn't set a date for beginning suborbital space flights from the spaceport as yet. To Sierra Nevada and Dream Chaser. Sierra Nevada Corporation will launch its Dream Chaser cargo spacecraft to the International Space Station on ULA's, United Launch Alliance's, Vulcan rocket. The 2 companies announced an agreement last week to use the Vulcan for at least 6 Dream Chaser missions to the station starting in 2021 on the rocket's second flight. Sierra Nevada Corporation said it considered ULA, as well as SpaceX, Blue Origin, European and Japanese vehicles, picking Vulcan because of the company's long working relationship with ULA and a really good competitive price that the companies declined to disclose. Sierra Nevada Corporation said it plans to keep Dream Chaser launch vehicle agnostic so that it can be launched on other vehicles on missions outside of its ISS cargo contract. Okay, back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Angelo. And finally tonight, the Philippines is the latest country to establish a space agency. President Rodrigo Duterte signed into law this month a bill passed by the country's Congress authorising the creation of a Philippine space agency. The agency will be responsible for issues of space science, technology and applications in the country. The government hasn't announced when the agency will start operations. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Angelo. And it's back to you, Andrew.